When she took office in 2019, New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham took over a state that had an economy closely tied to fossil fuels. Climate concerns were a hot issue leading up to Lujan Grisham taking office, with some New Mexicans marching to push for renewable energy in the state. Just weeks after taking office, the governor signed an ambitious executive order to try to get the state on track to meet climate goals. It included supporting the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, setting limits on emissions across the state, and committing to reducing statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by the year 2030. Now, KRQE News 13 is checking with experts to see how the state is doing on reaching those goals.
The state is not currently on track to meet those targets.
You can't talk about New Mexico's environmental efforts without talking about oil and gas.
Now we're the second largest oil producing state in the country. Because of a Permian oil boom, we are really pumping the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we have a responsibility to do something about that.
Data from the state shows over 400 companies produced more than 600 million barrels of oil in New Mexico last year, and along with the industry comes emissions. A 2020 report estimated that New Mexico's oil and gas industry released the equivalent of about 20 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in 2005. That's a healthy portion of the 75.6 million metric tons the state emitted as a whole that year. And the governor's executive order is trying to get the state to reduce that by 45%. Yet some say we're not on track.
So New Mexico has a target of reducing 45% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. That was signed in by the executive order by the governor, and also a target of 50% emissions by 2030 as being part of the U.S. Climate Alliance states. And what our analysis shows is that New Mexico will only reduce about a third of emissions as opposed to the 45% that they had initiated by the executive order. So there's 2/3 of emissions that are still unaccounted for that we need to make up in that time.
So why does it matter? Experts agree that climate change is having real impacts on New Mexico, and that's concerning to many.
Hundreds of New Mexicans called for action on climate, water, jobs, and justice.
Students are calling on legislators to declare a statewide climate emergency. The youth-led climate crisis.
Hundreds of APS students ditched school early to join others in downtown Albuquerque this afternoon to speak out on climate change. Organizers of the global climate strike.
The governor is concerned too. She made it a point to tackle climate change when she ran for the executive office in 2018 and has repeated the message over the years.
We can set incredibly ambitious standards. We can require accountability and leadership in making sure that we are addressing climate change in a comprehensive fashion.
While the Environmental Defense Fund says the state isn't on track to meet its goals, it seems like it's not for a lack of trying. During her first year in office, Michelle Lujan Grisham signed the Energy Transition Act, legislation that formalized New Mexico's effort to move away from coal and towards renewable energy. Outside of the Energy Transition Act, state agencies like the Environment Department have also been increasing efforts to limit emissions.
And so we need to make sure that what the companies tell us they're doing is actually what they're doing. And if we see patterns of excess emissions, that could be an opportunity for us to go out there and inspect and have boots on the ground, see what's really going on in this facility.
Still, there's only so much the agency can do, especially with a massive amount of production happening just over in Texas.
The air shed does not understand borders. And so I would say one of the big challenges is, even as we enforce on the New Mexico side, there are still issues on the Texas side that are outside of our jurisdiction.
The Environmental Defense Fund says one way to get New Mexico closer to its goals is by solidifying state rules into law.
Account for is that these goals were set by executive order, so they're nothing that's sort of written into law, into statute. And it's up to the directive of environmental agencies in the state to actually do the work to achieve those targets.
But there are challenges to creating more formal laws around environmental protection, and agencies sometimes have trouble enforcing existing rules given budget constraints.
Our environmental agencies are working really hard with very few resources, and it is ironic that we could have a close to $4 billion overrun in revenue and feel like we have to scrounge to get money for our agencies now.
Since the Environmental Defense Fund released its 2023 progress report, New Mexico has taken even more steps to clean the environment. That includes instituting clean car mandates that push the state towards electric vehicles. Yet some say the mandate is too much.
People want to be able to choose the vehicle that works for them. I'm not against electric vehicles as a blanket statement. I think there are some neat technologies out there, but they should be embraced by consumers and individual car purchasers, not forced upon us by a governor in search of environmental credibility with her base.
Other recent progress includes stricter regulations on where oil and gas companies can drill, including a moratorium on drilling near schools.
It is hard to formulate an argument against something that seems so common sense, right? We shouldn't have oil and gas wells near schools. However, I mean, there have been, folks who are critical, people who assert that maybe the industry would take an impact from it. So we have, we have done some due diligence around other states who have put setbacks in place. What have been the impacts to industry? And it is a very minuscule amount.
And there have been efforts to get those turned into state law.
Right now, the answer for this health risk lies with the legislature and the governor. So we are working with legislators, we are working with relevant regulatory agencies to look at putting setbacks for schools in statute. That is the only way to have a long-term solution for this health risk for New Mexicans.
But Republican lawmakers have opposed the efforts, and there is pressure to allow the oil and gas money to keep flowing from both state and federal land.
We are still in a situation politically in New Mexico where the oil and gas industry is too big, too valuable. The politicians like spending that money way too much for them to come after the industry hammer and tongs, so to speak.
Naturally, an apparent lack of progress can feel frustrating to some.
Yeah, it is. It can be frustrating to feel like after so many years of knowing what's happening that we still haven't made the transition that we need to. And I think that's partly because the big oil and gas extractors have done a really, don't know if I can call it good job, but effective job of suppressing information about the impacts of global climate change.
Still, New Mexico's leaders and politicians continue to take steps towards a cleaner future, and that suggests that New Mexico could reach its goals if leaders work together.